Hello and welcome to GBTA Collaboratory, our 2021 webinar series. The Road to Recovery, our travel industry update. This is our DEI session. My name is Dawn Murphy. I'm the Director of Global Operations here at GBTA, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce you to Maria Chevalier, Executive Vice President, Customer Success at PredictX, United States, and proudly a GBTA board member. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today, and welcome to GBTA's Collaboratory on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, or DEI. This is the third in a series tackling pressing and important topics in our industry. This 2021 lineup is designed to provide you with not only perspective and some great best practices, but takeaways, actionable takeaways related to the top themes and issues that GBTA will be exploring further during our upcoming annual convention, November 17th through 19th in Orlando. So as it comes to DEI and the commitment, 2/3 or 68% of GBTA's members said that their company has a DEI program in place. This using our 2019 membership demographics. This is an important figure, and interesting enough, it's higher on the travel buyer side, 76%, who work for a variety of industries versus that of the travel industry suppliers, which rank about 59%. It is likely, and we believe strongly, that these percentages are going to grow over the past 2 years since the survey was conducted, because we see the world focusing more and more and emphasizing more on DEI. But like anything that we do, there's room for improvement and advancement. And that's why we're doing these type of series. I'm so pleased to welcome today's expert speaker lineup, who will explore the many facets of DEI, why it's critical now more than ever, and to provide ideas and steps to help you to elevate your own DEI initiatives and programs. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our first discussion, why creating a corporate DEI program is critical to the success. It is presented by the GBTA committee, presented Grant Kaplan, who is the chair of the GBTA Diversity Committee. He is amazing, and I know you're going to get a lot from him and all the great work that he and the committee is doing. He is joined today by Lisa Harden, who is the Senior Manager, Supply Diversity for Salesforce, and David Porter, who is the Executive Vice President at the Federal Reserve Bank, San Francisco. I'm going to turn this over to Grant and the committee and the team to take you from here.
Thanks, Maria, and welcome to why creating a corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion program, a DEI program, is critical to your success. Our session description today calls for us to give you a little bit of information to boost your organization's reputation, to help you work within your corporate culture, and to talk about why it's so important so that those remainders from the 59% can maybe join and make us at 100%, as well as those on the buyer's side also. And congratulations to all of you for having an excellent, excellent percentage rating of DEI programs. Our committee is really quite interesting, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. But first, let's just talk about quickly, for those of you who are a little less familiar about DEI, and hopefully this will be a learning experience for everybody, even if you already are familiar, is about what is DEI. And really, I've got this, in this graphic, I had a D, an E, and an I where the three posts were. But what this really is this is climbing a staircase to reach the ultimate of inclusion. So in your companies already, you already have 1/3 of DEI accomplished, and you may not even know it. And that is D, diversity. Diversity is something that you sometimes can, but sometimes cannot see. And everybody's diverse in their own way. There's something about each one of us that's diverse and special. I was taught that since a little kid. And the question is, are we afraid of it? Or do we think it's cool? Do we embrace it and make the most of it and make it a beauty of our organizations? So knowing that you already have that letter knocked off, now you have to move to E, equity. And equity means you're going to treat everybody the same way, and that their diversity does not affect how they're treated. This means glass ceilings for certain gender identity employees. This means maybe glass ceilings even for certain sexual identity employees or racial identity employees. This means a lot of things need to be more equal and equitable for everybody. When you have that society really mixed in your company and set up very well so that people are treated equal, you'll have inclusion. And you can see at the top of the staircase is inclusion, because that's really the goal, is including everybody and celebrating them. So let's ask you a little bit about your organizations before we talk about the committee, because I want you to know what we're focusing on here. Or we could do our polling question later, but let's get it out of the way now. I want to know, so we understand who we're talking to, what best characterizes the status of DEI in your company? And this is a question you can answer right online. What best characterizes the status? It could be one of many things. We have a very short time in this session, so I'd appreciate your answering pretty quickly. And if you go ahead and answer that, we'll get a sense of who's online. And we know what the statistic is for GBTA, thanks to Maria. And we might be in many different places. And just because we're in a place that has more room to go doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It means we're already started. So it's a good thing. So we can talk a little bit about the GBTA DEI committee while we're waiting for you to answer the questions. And our committee is a very large committee. It's the very first ever globally curated GBTA committee. So because we have a globally curated committee, we looked for global diversity as well as personal diversity in our membership of our committee, plus of course, strong passion. And our committee, if you look at who's on it on the GBTA website, it's an amazing group of people, including Sean Cole that you'll hear from shortly. And of course, one of our founding members was Maria Chevalier, who's on the board now. So we really have an excellent group, and we divided ourselves into 6 different subcommittees. And the real work of our committee, because we have 22 plus people, the real work of our committee is done in the subcommittee level. And we have a subcommittee devoted to accessibility, race and culture, LGBTQ. And the one on the bottom that didn't come through very well is generational equality. And then of course, mental health balance and gender balance. So we're talking about many issues that make us diverse and things that can make us also othered in our company. And we don't want that to happen. So we want to discuss in a travel sense, what's this like? What is the experience of certain races traveling in a country where they're the outsider? And are they comfortable traveling for our companies? Do we make them feel included in the program? And so on. What we're talking about really is a lot of difficult issues. So we really want to go from this subcommittee structure and talk about what we're really getting at here. It's really being uncomfortable. It's sometimes uncomfortable to discuss these things. So we say in our committee that we need to get people comfortable with being uncomfortable. And once you can do that, you can discuss all sorts of issues openly and honestly and make them easier and better for your society and your company. So there's some helpful stats about DEI. And then let's talk about the stats of the poll that we asked after that. When you look at our companies, you can see that most of us want to increase our diversity, but it takes work. We have to actually welcome diversity. We can see that very few Fortune 500 companies have female CEOs, and female identified, or non-male identified, I should say, CEOs really add a lot. And you can see that if you do some more reading in the Harvard study or in the McKinsey study. And this 6.6 number, actually, I've seen all the way up to 7.5%. And even at the highest number, 7.5%, is not representative of women in society or in corporate America. So there's work to be done. And you can see that a very high percentage of CEOs are white, male identified CEOs. The gap between the 90% and the 6.6% and where 100% comes in means very few are anything other than identified as white men or some women. When we don't know what their racial background is, I have to believe there's probably a high concentration of white women. Let's look at our survey study, that our poll question, and you can see that there is a reasonable distribution between the first two options, and that's really great. There's room for 11%, 14%, and so about 30% of us, there's room for us to do better. And if you want some assistance or whatever, or you want to ask some questions, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is on the last slide, and I'll be glad to talk to you and help you. If you are a chapter of GBTA, I'll be happy to speak for your chapter also, or get somebody on our committee to do that. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So it's important to have real proof that we are moving forward. And one of those is that the SEC has approved a NASDAQ proposal that should increase DEI really in company boardrooms. So this is coming to a boardroom near you soon. And this was published in the Harvard Business Review. And one of the things that the Harvard Business Review said was, at a minimum, future success demands this. Okay? So let's ask a question to our guest presenters. My question to you all is, why does DEI have an impact? So to you, David, first.
Well, I think the reality is, and thing that oftentimes people don't think about, is at the end of the day, organizations are trying to solve difficult and complex problems. And in order to be able to do that, you want to have diverse perspectives. And one of the things that having diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization, it brings in those diverse perspectives and provides a context where people can share those diverse perspectives in a safe way, which allows people to build on their ideas, to come up with stuff that is more resilient, more impactful, and ultimately more profitable. And that's what HBR is trying to highlight.
Yeah, and you can see here in this slide, real proof number 2, that when you look at companies that were surveyed in 2014, 17, and 19, when you look at their gender diversity, those that increased their gender diversity, their profits went up 15, 21, and 25%. When they increased their ethnic diversity and really celebrated it to solve problems in different ways, they went up even higher. So diversity brings profit to companies. And for us all on this webinar, we can be leaders in our companies by helping the company to reach that. And there's much more research than just this that's available. And if you want some, just give me a note. I want to go back one slide, please, Don, if you don't mind. I want to ask the same question to Lisa, though. why do you think DEI has an impact? Your organization is distinctly different from David's as a financial institution, and you're a technology company, a software company. So tell us why DEI has an impact for you.
Just to resonate based on the data that's shown here, as the comments David made, diversity at the top level, being sanctioned from the SEC for the boards, but also, and you have to trail that down to the C-suite and to senior leadership. As companies have recognized over, in recent years, I'll say, that it's not just okay to have the workforce diverse, that they have to do intentional work to make sure that we're elevating women, people of color, people, disabled people, and people in the LGBT community, to bring all of that culture, all of those various backgrounds into senior level positions that are making changes within the organization. It has been proven, McKinsey has done several studies, as shown here, that diverse companies and the diverse people making decisions definitely increase profits. So it's just not something to do to help the community, as we should say, but companies are missing out who are not implementing diverse within leadership as well. The economics are just there.
Right. The economics are undoubtable. In fact, my other half and I, we invested in a fund that was devoted to companies that celebrate diversity, and it's still climbing. It's excellent. Would you, Lisa, give a concrete example of something you've seen in Salesforce that really bears this out?
Yes. So, Salesforce in 2015 really took a deep look into what diversity looked like at Salesforce, and made significant changes. We hired a chief diversity officer. We started looking at pay equality, and all of those things impacted not only the talent that was looking to come to Salesforce, but retaining talent at Salesforce. And as everyone knows, the annual revenue at Salesforce has continued to outperform any projections of what we should be doing. A lot of that is contributed to the talent that we're able to retain as well as get. And also, when you have a diverse group of people working on a project, it has been proven that it's more innovative.
Yeah, and we see that over and over and over in the studies that have been done about this. Innovation comes from diverse approaches to a problem, and those can be in the boardroom, those can be in your travel program, those can be having suppliers that are diverse and giving multiple perspectives. David, can you also give some concrete examples? And by the way, Lisa, that's why I'm a happy shareholder of Salesforce.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, I'm going to go back to my old job when I talk about an application where diversity mattered, just because it's just different. In my previous life, I used to do diversity in the entertainment industry. And a while ago, the chairman of FX and the chairman and president of HBO decided that they were going to have diverse, they were going to require that their shows had either women or people of color as directors for 50% of their shows. And they did this because they just fundamentally believed in it. And what they found after they implemented this, not only did they get great shows, as shown by the increase in ratings, as shown by increase in awards, but even every accolade they could find, people were like, wow, the shows are just better. And people were asking what was going on. Why could this happen that just the CEOs would make this decision and boom, you get better results? And what people found out is in the previous environment where things were a little bit more discriminatory, basically as opposed to letting the best people contribute, what they had done was they had excluded a whole bunch of people. So they ended up having average, or some might say mediocre directors, most of whom happen to be white males, as opposed to some of the talented but women and people of color who had been discriminated against have been excluded. And so one of the things about diversity, equity, and inclusion is this inclusion piece. When you bring in people, all of a sudden you are drawing from a broader audience of individuals, a broader set of individuals who can bring in their different sets of talent that oftentimes organizations don't represent. And this applies to every organization on the planet. And so if you are having a space, if you create an organization where you're excluding folks, you're leaving talent on the table that otherwise you could take advantage of.
Absolutely. That's wow. Thank you so much, David. We have a really good question from somebody watching the webinar asking, could the increase in profit for additional diversified groups in an organization possibly be quantified partially by new startups and those who have fresh and new ideas rather than legacy companies? Do you have a feeling for this? Because legacy companies might be slower to make changes, and this is a really good question.
I do think that, it's all about culture at a company. And, legacy companies have, it tends to take longer for change to happen. That's definitely true. But of course, that is a bias that I think a lot of us have when we start talking about the legacy companies. And so we have to be careful with that, right? But I do think that, the legacy companies that are listening to their employees, particularly through their ERG groups, their employee resource groups, the ones who have expanded their employee resource groups to include, all kinds of diverse groups. We tend to think, their diversity is, gender related or ethnic related. But those companies that also include the LGBT community, disability, or even other types of challenges or opportunities that employees face, on a regular basis, that want to have a support and a resource group together. When we start looking at the travel industry and utilizing those employee resources groups to understand what travel looks like for them, right? I think, so many times, we don't understand those unconscious biases and those microaggressions that people face when they travel. Even though, for example, from racial biases that are known throughout various countries of the world, and even in certain sections of the U.S., those gender-related, LGBT-related, things that are aware. But what about those unconscious biases and those microaggressions that people that actually are in those categories face, that aren't talked about, that should be recognized? And I think if the travel departments tapped into their employees to understand, especially when, they are planning on doing conventions and conferences in certain cities, definitely get the feedback to make sure that the attendees are going to be welcomed and feel comfortable being there.
Excellent, thanks. Let's talk about the different ways you might look at doing a DEI program in your company. And you have to have an understanding of your company and what you're aiming towards with your DEI program. What measurements do you want to best? So you may have some of them looking really good and others that need some work on it. But the question is, how do you go about all this? You can allow data to control your decision-making process. So that means you're data-driven, like is shown here. And you'll find that you will make maybe 75% of your decisions based on data. Or you can be data informed, where you do use data as part of the decision-making matrix, but you also look on other factors, a little bigger percentage of your decision-making. And so really there's two ways to go about this. David, do you have a preference of which of these two you use, or you would counsel other people to use?
And to be honest, I say both. I mean, one of the things around diversity, equity, inclusion, it's a complex problem. And to solve complex problems in large or small organizations, you need to approach them from multiple and different perspectives. And so what I try to do is I want to make sure I'm data driven. I also want to make sure I'm data informed. And I think one of the most critical things I want to do, and then what I certainly do within the bank, is I remember that metrics motivate. If I want to create a world where diversity matters, where there's diversity, equity, inclusion, I have to have real metrics which measure both the diversity, the equity within the organization, and the inclusion within the organization, and I hold people responsible for that. The challenge that DEI has had in our workplace, in every organization that I've seen, is that at the end of the day, oftentimes we treat diversity as a nice thing to have, but we don't treat it the same way we treat marketing or sales. You would never tell a sales executive, hey, I want you to go out and work hard. I don't care what kind of revenue you bring in. You give them specific targets. But for DEI, we reward people for effort. Then we ask why that doesn't happen, because people will always pay attention to what you reward. So if people don't listen to anything I said today, remember that metrics motivate, and that you want to have rigorous metrics if you're going to try to get DEI in your organization.
I agree. And we see that there are many different things you can measure. This could be a further discussion if anybody wants to have it afterward. My email's at the bottom of the last slide. So how do we get there? And really, you have to take many different steps. And I'll just talk to a couple of them, but getting information is important so that you can be both data-driven and data-informed, as David mentioned. I think that's the best, healthiest approach, is to take multiple approaches. It's why diversity works. Definitely connecting with your ERGs, your employee resource groups, is important because their experience will enrich your outcome. And then seeking some outside certifications. That might seem like it's very superficial, but it actually isn't. It has a lot of meaning behind it, and you have to go through certain hoops in order to achieve certifications that prove your achievement in this area. So there is quite a path, and it is multi-stage. You do need to take and start with a discussion, but move to action, right? Move to action. Don't just stay at discussion forever, and action really counts louder. Let's just look at the last slide and really talk about any quick wrap-ups. And it means that embedding DEI requires high-level action. And we say this about travel programs. Anything you want to do in travel, you need support from up above in your organizational structure. And broadening your professional structures really takes work. It's not just something you say you're going to do and it happens. It takes work. And tokenism is really not enough. It takes much more to be totally inclusive in your company and to get the benefit of inclusivity. So there's a lot of reasons why to do this, and this all pays off. I'm curious of any wrap-up comments you might have, David, and then let's move on to Lisa.
The only thing I would say is that any efforts that you do matter. So whether you're at the top of the organization, if you're in the middle of the organization, or you're an employee who's just starting out, everyone's got to look at this as their challenge. Everyone's got to figure out the things that they can do every day to create an environment that's more inclusive. And if we do that collectively over time, we will make progress.
I agree. Lisa, your comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to stress it has to be an intentional strategy. Just to piggyback on what David said, if you don't do the intentional work, if you just like David said, efforts can be rewarded, but it's actual metrics that are being met that matter. So with that being said, sometimes you have to do the intentional, and that's how I want to wrap up.
Yeah, intention does make a difference, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
Just by being here on this webinar, everybody who's attended shows intention of improvement. And there's 36% of you that said you have room for improvement, very honestly. And that's great. I mean, you have to know who you really are. So I think there's potential in this session and the other two coming to really give you more chance to advance your own company, to be a leader within your own company as a travel buyer or as a travel supplier. There is leadership for you to take and make the best of by knowing this. And so it's in your hands to be part of the action. And we welcome you to take action. We welcome you to keep up with the DEI committee. We appreciate all of your listening to this session. And I appreciate having Lisa and David. What wonderful presenters you are and great perspectives you have. Thanks very much. And I look forward to talking to you more in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Outstanding session. 30 minutes is too short. We want to talk to all of you much longer. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to introduce the next session that is coming to all of you. Please do be sure to put your questions in the Q&A box at any given time. We are monitoring that and we want to hear from you and help you along the way. The next session is DEI. I understand that I'll never understand. However, I stand. And this is Sean Cole is our moderator for today. Sean is the Vice President of Global Sales at Delta Airlines and is also a member of GBTA DEI Committee. We also have Annalise Glandorf, Global Corporate Travel Experience Manager, Shell International, and Kira Johnson, Vice President and Chief DE&I Officer at Delta Airlines. Thank you all for joining, and I turn it over to you now.
Simply, whoa. Lisa, David, Grant, they knocked it out of the park with that 30-minute conversation. I took a lot of nuggets away, and I see why they led off this session. So we have big shoes to fill, but I'm confident that Annalise and Kira, we're going to step up to the plate. But first of all, good morning again, and thank you for participating in today's conversation. We have a rich dialogue planned on diversity, equity, and inclusion, offering valuable insights and unique perspectives to address, one, why does DE&I matter? Two, what the DE&I actions can you implement to create real change? And then how can you be an advocate for change? So I'm going to turn the first question over to Kira Lynn Johnson. But before I do that, everybody who's on here, you're part of this conversation. So we value your input and questions. So please use that Q&A function to ask any questions of us. But I'll start with Kira Lynn. So in business, we know that accountability starts at the top. As an executive of a large enterprise, what does it look like when that top person takes DE&I as mission critical? It's not a check the box endeavor. We kind of heard a little bit about that with David talking about metrics motivate, but turn it over to you, Kira.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks for that question, because I think it's so important. We hear in this space often that it's critical that a company's diversity, equity, and inclusion focus starts at the top. And, I certainly don't disagree. I think just like anything else in the company, the strategy, where your leadership spends its energy, it matters. It matters not only to the business community, but it matters to the employees. It matters to your suppliers. It matters to the communities you serve. So that support at the highest level of the organization is certainly super, super, super important. What I will say is that's exactly what your question speaks to, Sean, is it makes sure that it doesn't simply check a box. Checking a box is really just saying, I care. But when you have that level of accountability at the very top, you move from that notion of simply caring to really solving a problem. We heard in the last session, these are complex problems. And so you've got to have the focus at every level of your organization to serve complex problems. So while that's important, the thing I really like to reinforce, though, is also having support just at the top isn't enough. Often with DE&I efforts, you find that you've got great support at the top of your organization. You're going to have just a very human and natural groundswell often for DE&I within your organization. And I think the real problem that companies are solving for is you have to make sure that this work doesn't get stuck in the middle. So support from the top is really important. The groundswell from the bottom is really important, but it can't get stuck in the middle. And one way to make sure that it doesn't get stuck in the middle is that the organization has to align itself at every level of the organization around a really clear diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And importantly, it's got to align itself around what better looks like. We heard it in the last section. It's no longer good enough just to say, we want to do better. You have to show people what better looks like. So you have to set tangible and measurable goals around better. But I'm also a big believer that when you're talking about better, you can't simply talk about this work through the lens of percentages. So better also means making sure that you're measuring better through the lens of progress. So once again, accountability at every level, starting at the top, but everyone in the company has to be held accountable to a clear DE&I plan with tangible metrics and measurements to say, what does better look like along the way?
Thank you, Kira. That was spot on. And I think that even though in all organizations, certainly in for-profit, that accountability does start at the top, but I like how you said, look, it's everybody has a part to get better. How do we show progress in everybody? What you're going to hear as we go through this, the audience, is what can you do? You can be that catalyst for change, that positive change. The next question is for you, Annalise. I see you there in the Hague in the Netherlands. Hopefully it's warm over there. It's a little bit rainy in Atlanta. But in your opinion, how do you think Shell's bottom line, as well as the travel industry as a whole, can be enhanced by investing time and resources towards creating an open DE&I environment?
Yes, thank you for that question. Can you hear me well?
Yes,
Good.
hear you really well.
Thank you. Yeah, so at a global Shell level, I think it's truly embedded in our organization what the added value of that is. So we have a global D&I team that makes a great job of explaining how true inclusion is beneficial for the company as a whole. So not just for employee well-being, psychological safety and productivity, but also to be an attractive employer and making the market that we can recruit from more diverse and bigger overall. We've heard that before today. And also to create the right customer value proposition, right? It's a sound basis for doing business, but we also want to be inclusive and show that we're inclusive so people buy from us. And this understanding is truly embedded, I think, throughout the organization as of the day that you are onboarded. It does mean that the senior leadership in our company is very supportive of the work that we do in the corporate travel team where I sit. So I just wanted to share a small example that may help others on the call to really implement this. So we started with a small survey among female travelers to understand what they faced when they travel. And 690 women across the globe came back with their answers. And the outcome was quite significant. So there were really rather large concerns raised by the women, and some felt really unsafe. And our executive committee gave us full support to start to address this. So what we are now doing is to identify the issues and try to mitigate solutions for that, and then have workshops with other networks in our company, such as the LGBT community and the Enable community, as we call it, to really hear from them what is it that we can improve so everyone can be equally productive and safe as they travel. And this very much resonates with what Lisa and Grant said. Tap into the employees, get the feedback, be data driven. And it seems that it has to be a continuous cycle of reaching out to your travelers, to your end user, and really try and understand what is it that they need, implement and go back for that feedback, and create the psychological safety for people to dare to speak up what is a concern to them. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is that we also now find that industry standards could be very beneficial, I think, for all of us. So if suppliers would have standards around accessibility or certain D&I regulations, it would really help us to source responsibly and to drive this forward. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thanks, Annalise. I think one of the keys that you said, and there are a lot of nuggets, you did a survey. You surveyed women travelers, and it kind of talked about that in a previous session, and it goes from something that Peter Drucker said, you can't change what you can't measure. So it's doing a survey, it's having those conversations, but then it's up to you to make an impact. And I really like that perspective. And hopefully the audience is getting that. It's not only at the top, but what can you do to make change? As a GBTA member, you know that the travel environment is completely different now with the pandemic. Is going to be different coming out of it, but we have a responsibility to make it better. And I think that's what we're saying in the DE&I space. And the travel industry is about $1.4 trillion that passed through, but we have to look at ourselves honestly and say, what can we do to make it better for everyone? And DE&I is not just a check the box. It's not just, some people think that it's just, Caucasian, or if you identify yourself as Black, it's beyond that. Were you born in a country where you live or work? Did you grow up in a city or rural environment? Are you an introvert or extrovert? All of these things are really important. So we have to understand those numerous dimensions, which brings up my next question for Kira, which has to do with the equity piece of DE&I. In your opinion, let's talk about why that's important and why equity and equality are not synonymous.
No, such an important thing for us to understand as we think about this work. And I think in addition to needing to solve things, you have to measure things in order to be able to solve them. One of the things I feel strongly about is you really have to understand issues to solve them. I'm a real big believer that you just really can't come up with a great solution if you don't actually understand what the issue is. And one of the issues I really think people are learning to unpack differently in this work is a really deep understanding of equity. And you said it in your question, Sean. It's really important that we understand that equality and equity aren't synonyms. And they're both important, and they're important for different reasons. But in this space, we often have to differentiate and understand that, while equality may be, opening that door for everyone, equity says I'm making sure that the pathway through to that door is reasonable for everyone. Equality is providing, equal access, equal opportunities for everyone. But equity says I'm making sure that people have the opportunity and access that they need, that's meaningful for them. I think one of the most simple examples I have, they always say, if you want to explain something complex, explain it to a child. That doesn't always work in my family because I have children who challenge me on everything, but really need a deep level of understanding. But I read where someone was talking about, equality is making sure that everyone has a pair of shoes. But equity is making sure that everyone has a pair of shoes that fits. Well, my daughter took that a step further, because when we determined, well, not just that fit, but shoes that are right for the environment. So for example, Sean, for me, shoes that are right on the weekend are probably going to be a pair of tennis shoes, because I'm going to be somewhere at a US football game. But if you know Sean, like I know Sean, his weekend shoes are probably going to be dressy because he's going to be somewhere upscale in the city. So it's not only everyone having shoes, it's everyone having shoes that fit, but it's also having shoes that fit for your situation. And so when we think about equality and equity, I think that actually is now becoming the game changer in this work. We've been talking about diversity for a very long time. We've been talking about inclusion for a very long time. But when you start talking about equity, not only do you bring more people to the table, but you begin to understand the issues differently. As an example, at Delta, we have very measurable goals about how we're closing representation gaps. But we didn't approach that just through the lens of, yes, we need more representation. That was kind of like the duh factor. Of course, we want and we need more representation. But we looked at it really through a lens of equity. And by that, I mean, we looked at where diversity was present and where it wasn't present. And probably consistent with the stories that you see in a lot of corporate America, we saw that it was kind of ever present at the entry-level parts of our organization, but less present in the more senior roles. The reality is, yes, not only through a measurable lens, but we looked at that picture and said, you know what? When we look at that and we look at where decisions, where influence, we could even use the word where power sits, and then we look where we've distributed work, that's not a picture of equity. That doesn't reflect something that we're really proud of. And so notice I said, you know, what got people to that conversation differently wasn't just about representation. It was also that we could look at that picture and say, if 40% of our workforce represents women, and 20% of our workforce represents women in leadership, that's not a picture of equity. And we broke that down by other demographics, because it's also important that you disaggregate your data, not just by race and gender, but look at it by location, look at it by level, look at it by work category, because once again, you've got to understand these problems so that you can dissect and be very prescriptive about those areas of equity. But to your question, I want people just to understand that the reason why equity is so important is because it will cause you to look at your organization and find not just people opportunities, but find systems and processes that need to be revamped so that we don't just create an equal environment for everyone, we create the opportunities that everyone needs to succeed.
I love it. There's a lot in what you said. I'm just going to kind of put it in my words and take it away. And you kind of heard this from the initial session. I keep going back, but Kira just broke it down. You have to look at the data, and the data is going to be very revealing. You know, what is your workforce? What are the demographics? For Delta, it was 40%, and I think this is real, or maybe it's an example that Kira gave. 40% are female, but the leadership is only 20%. Well, then you can go and take action. And it's action, and so everybody can bring their full self to that job to make it more equitable. And I think one of the things, another thing that Kira kind of highlighted on is, you know, when I was first coming into the business arena, and you always want to point your finger and say, well, they should do that better. They should do that better. The leadership should do it. And then you have to look at yourself. What am I doing to make a difference? Because the corporations that we represent, it's us as well. So are we going to be that change, that catalyst to do things better? And I'll give you an example. When I was starting out, I was working in really a tough environment, working a lot of hours, and I had an opportunity to hire a number two. And my boss at the time said, hey, your leading candidate, Sean, that you're presenting to me is a female. And I'm like, yeah, like I want to hire her. And he was like, well, what if she has, you know, babies? That means more work for you. And I'm like, that's fine. And the reason that I said that is because I'm married, I have a wife, and I couldn't bear the fathom that somebody would not advance my wife because she was going to have children. But again, that's how you stand up, but do it in a way that is going to be beneficial for everyone. So now we're at the point of the program where we're going to turn it over to the audience for Q&A, and I'm looking for some questions. And I think the first one, Annalise, is going to go to you. What can someone do as an individual to make a difference in this space? So what can someone do as an individual to make a difference in the DE&I space?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to a lot that was said already today, but I just want to reiterate, I think you really should talk to your stakeholder or your end user or your customer to find out what it is that they are experiencing. So in my case, it is, you know, the 68,000 travelers in Shell. I can think that we created beautiful processes and we have the best tools. But if I go out and ask them in a very personal session where they feel at ease, you know, to tell me what they're actually experiencing, I find out that, hey, it's not actually all okay. And my own perspective doesn't mean that they feel the same. That was a big learning for me. You know, you come from a certain, as you say, background, maybe city life, and, you know, I go and travel and I'm fine, but not everyone is. So I would encourage everyone to, what can you do? Set up a small session with a small diverse group of people, and by diverse I also mean, from different countries, different ages, different gender, and ask for their feedback. And you'd be surprised, they will probably also want to continue to talk to you as you identify the improvement areas and you start to implement and become that ambassador in the company even. So that's, I think, a great way to start.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I want to highlight something. We got to understand that we don't have all the answers. There's blind spots. Create what Annalise is saying. Who can you talk to understand how can you make something better? And I think that one, like we're doing this session today, you have friends that you can reach out to and like, well, how did you start this at Shell or Delta or the Federal Reserve? So don't be afraid to challenge what you don't know, because it'll make it better for other people. There's another question that I think is really good, and I'm going to direct this to you, Kira. And I don't know if you can see it in the Q&A session, but it goes about the introduction of the survey and data, and how do you start that benchmarking, and how do you get people to be feel safe to answer the questions authentically. Can you take that one, Kira?
Yeah, I'll just add a little perspective there. I think, it's, first, it may just start with something that seems pretty tactical and fundamental. But, at our company, we use a trusted third-party survey vendor. It just helps with that level of separation, so employees don't feel like, HR is behind the scenes looking, or, the person internally who has access to the survey tool can report on it. So trying to create that environment of it being truly safe and an anonymous place. A lot of creating that culture, though, is going to happen before the survey starts. So you want to do things to make sure you're creating, a safe environment where employees feel that they can speak up. I would say one way to build that, but also more than just building the safe environment, also to give some credibility so that people will be willing to speak up, is that when you get the data, do something with it. And communicate it back out to people. I think sometimes the survey data may not say what we want it to say. And so we hold that as a leadership team, and we're going to go solve these problems and put on our capes behind the scenes, and no one knows we're even trying to solve these problems. So I think when you can be super transparent and say, here's what we heard, here's where we know we need to improve, here's what we're really proud of, but here's what we're going to do to improve. And then when you do those things to improve, I think it's also important to map that back to the survey. So if you make a change as a result of feedback you got, sometimes, once again, we know we've done it based on the feedback, but it's good when you're communicating to employees to say, we heard from you that you wanted more opportunities to talk about these complex issues, and that's why we've launched this series. So just mapping it back. So I think when people see that the survey actually yields results, people will grow in their confidence to participate. But also, I think it gives them, an understanding that we're not looking for who said what, we're just looking for how to be better.
Yeah, that's spot on. I think the key, Kira said a lot of valuable things, but you got to be transparent. And to me, we, as an individual leader, we do engagement surveys of our team. How are they doing? How do they feel? What we can do better? But I tell my team members, my direct reports, it's kind of the answers to the test when they give us a survey back. It lets us know what we need to work on, and we need to share that, because there's nothing like asking someone to do a survey and you don't give them the results of the action plans. I think Kira just nailed it. And don't be afraid from it. If you're here, you need to know you're here so you have opportunity to build up. But if you're at the top, well, what can I do to continue to enhance that? Because it's not something that is static, it's dynamic. Nobody has solved the magic elixir of DE&I. The last, probably one more question or two, because we have about 6 minutes and I want to make sure we're punctual. But I'm going to turn this back over to Kira. Can you talk about unconscious bias and what we can do to be more aware of our own biases?
Yeah, the good news, Sean, is there are a lot of people who are covering this space. And so, whether it's self-study or whether it's, like the training we offer at Delta, I think we as a society have graduated past the understanding that unconscious bias is real. I think the one piece of advice I give people is it is more than recognizing that we all have unconscious bias, but you've got to figure out how you can practice to be consciously inclusive. And so almost moving to the flip side of that coin, yes, we have unconscious bias and you should mitigate that at all costs. But the reality is, I think what actually motivates an organization to success is when you have individuals figuring out how they can be consciously inclusive.
Perfect. So I'm going to wrap it up so we're on time, but I'm going to turn it over to Annalise and Kira for any closing remarks, and then I'll close it out. But Annalise, what would you like the audience to take away from the session today?
I think that, the start is in your hand. So is there anything are you keen to improve and make your company more inclusive? Then find that stakeholder group that you can work with, and and just get going and give them that security that their feedback is in good hands with you. And as Kira said, follow back up. It's exactly what we did. We have heard you. This is what we're doing. It's going to take time. However, these are the things that we're working on. So I think that's also very powerful.
Thank you very much, Kira.
I think what Annalise said is so important. The concept of the start is in your hand. Often with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're all sitting around and we're waiting for that change to happen by, the company. And the reality is we've got to remember that the company is made up of a collection of individuals. And so we all have a role to play in, creating the company that we want to be a part of. We are the change. One thing that I often say is that there's really no guilt associated with privilege as long as it isn't wasted. And so we all need to sit and challenge ourselves. We all sit in a position of privilege for some reason. It could be the access you have to leaders. It could be the knowledge you have. It could, there's something that you bring to the table that you can use to help someone else on this journey.
I love that. Help somebody else on this journey. I'm reminded of hearing the first session and hearing from Annalise and Kira, something that I reflect on a lot. It's no one can do everything, but someone can do something. And it's really taking that step forward as an individual to create that positive change, because it's one person, it can do something. Can't do everything, but they can do something. It's almost like Mahatma Gandhi, be the change that you want to see in the world. But hopefully this was valuable. Hopefully you're getting some nuggets, some resources. Reach out to us on LinkedIn. But I think we're one step closer to making it better, is what Kira said. But it's the individual actions and it's the collective actions. So again, thank you for joining us this morning. Be safe, be positive, and I will see you guys later. Bye-bye. Thanks, Kira.
Thank you.
Annalise.
Thank you so much, Sean, Kira, and Annalise. Again, I'll say it again. I wish we could have much more than 30 minutes with all of you. And be sure to reach out to all of our panelists. They have offered to help you, so please do that. Next in our webinar today is why you need a supplier diversity program now. This is presented by our Meetings and Events Committee. Our moderator today is Shauna Whitehead. Shauna is the Vice President, Customer Solutions for BCD Meetings and Events. Shauna, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dawn. Super excited to be speaking with you all today. I'm going to try and keep this energy going because it's been, it's just been great listening to so many passionate speakers. So excited for our panel to share a couple of stories with you today. Hopefully they'll either help with some ideas on kickstarting a diverse supplier program, or maybe evolving what you're doing today. I'm really passionate about advancing the subject within our own customer base. DEI is a really critical component to our maturity model tool, which we really help to optimize customers' meetings programs. So I'm probably coming at it at a little bit more of a meetings lens, but I know some of our panelists are really looking at that travel meetings category overall. But it's been great to hear, so many tips and tricks today already. It's an area that we're continuing to learn and evolve and innovate within, which I think is exciting for everybody. I'm going to quickly let our panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into some Q&A. Paula, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Paula Fenn. I'm the Senior Manager Global Corporate Travel Services for TIAA. I oversee our domestic employee travel program and our internal offsite meetings team. TIAA is a Fortune 100 financial services company. We serve those who serve others, and we're very proud to be led by one of 2 African-American female CEOs in the Fortune 100. Anthony?
Thanks, Paula. Can everyone hear me okay? Just want to make sure. I'm the managing director for meeting and events at Travel Leaders Corporate. I oversee sales, account management, and operations within our organization, and have good insight into what our customers are looking for in a DE&I program. Generally, what we'll do is try to help them advance that process within the solutions that we provide for them.
Thanks, Anthony. So we can move on to sort of defining or approaching, right? And as we look to define diverse suppliers, we've got a broad definition here and some groups that you'll probably find familiar on the screen, but it's really important to note that as you define diverse suppliers within your own organization, you'll need to take some time understanding the landscape that you're operating in, right? So both connecting globally to understand how this definition might differ in your different regions or markets, but also looking to apply some leveling. So having consideration for diverse suppliers that obviously have a full certification, but some that don't, but still identify as that diverse supplier in their own right. Or maybe even starting to look at recognizing suppliers that may contribute to your downstream spend through other suppliers. I'll just pause here for a minute. Just any quick comments on how your organization has categorized or sort of approach setting this up from the onset, understanding that you work solely in the US, so won't necessarily have that global lens to bring in.
For TIAA, and especially in the travel and the meeting spend area, we look at hotel spend versus non-hotel spend. And also, where can we shift things? It may not be, we may not be able to support a small business or minority-owned person in a hotel area, but can we make sure we're supporting somebody who isn't against those areas too? And when we're looking at hotel spend, is there anything that can be locally sourced? If we're getting centerpieces, can they be locally sourced? And then we look at our non-hotel spend, entertainment. Can we go to a venue that's locally owned that might have a really good reputation or support? Can we look at speakers? Can we look at DJs? Any of the accessories or additional spend, like photo booths, photographers. When we're looking at transportation, can we look at a local provider for both individual transportation and also for group transportation? DMC, our destination management companies, are they locally sourcing anything? And we're also having the conversation with our providers, letting them know that this is a passion for TIAA and that we want them to continue this for us. If we're asking them to do something on our behalf, can they use a provider that is either certified or non-certified? Because especially right now through the pandemic, we have a lot of pop-ups and they may not have gotten through the certification program yet, but we don't want to discard them. And we want to make sure that we include anybody that we can to help in this area. And one of the biggest areas that we look at is catering and restaurants. There's a lot of minority-owned or small business, women-owned restaurants, LGBTQ-owned restaurant. I mean, we can support these individuals or these companies, and it makes a big difference. Anthony?
Yeah, no, that's great. I might move on. I'm gonna tee up a question for you in our key drivers, because I think there's a lot of different drivers and benefits to why you should have a diverse supplier program in place. And Anthony, I know you're speaking about a program that your company supports, but can you talk a little bit about maybe why that diverse supplier program is a key focus for them as an organization, but also maybe touch on some of the commercial benefits that they have seen throughout their program and setting that up?
Sure. Earlier, I heard Lisa mention intentional strategy, and I would say with this particular client, this has been an intentional strategy they've had for quite some time. It falls under their core values. I would call it a cultural cornerstone, to be honest. They're definitely committed to an inclusive society, and it goes way beyond the four walls of their business, right? They apply it to their suppliers, to their partners, and it's represented in their marketing, right? They hope to drive change within their supplier base and an impact around the globe. And internally, leaders, managers, and employees are empowered to help drive this improvement. Some of the commercial benefits, though, really come in the form of the ability to get differentiated solutions, to have a lower cost base at times, because many of the diverse suppliers have a more flatter organization and can have less cost at hand. But it's not always just about that cost element. Sometimes it's to obtain additional creativity and ideas. And I think I heard that as well through some of the other conversations around the innovation, right? Why having open access to many suppliers gives you that insight in terms of the innovation and talent that's really out there in the marketplace.
Thanks, Anthony. No, I think that's great. It's so many benefits, it's hard to sort of pinpoint. And I think we're continuing as we evolve, we see more and more, right? So I know that your organization has a pretty long history actually with DEI, and it's really part of sort of the DNA and how your company, does business. So given you've been at it for a while, I think you have a really nice story about how a successful partnership with a diverse supplier has positively impacted not just your business, but their business as well. Can you walk us through sort of that story?
Most definitely. And TIA is very proud to be on the Diversity Inc.'s top 50 D&I list. We started off in 2015, number 37. I'm proud to say that this year, or 2020, we cracked the top 10 and we're now number 9 on that list. When we were looking at our spend for the meeting side, one of the categories that we were able to identify that could be an area that we could see we can move share to was our transportation. So here locally in Charlotte, where our largest office is, we started looking at transportation providers and found a local provider that could provide as much transportation, not just on the group side, but also on the transient side. And we were able to start with this new provider, and they were just a local region, like a local Carolinas provider. And with our support and our help, they're now in the Southeast. It's not just a Charlotte-based company. They've now expanded. And that's one of the things that we're most proud about, is being able to help support and elevate other companies, especially in this area.
Great, thank you. I'm going to stay on with you for a second. You kind of talked about, prior, how you wanting to capture all sorts of supplier spend, right? Diverse supplier spend, whether they're, fully recognized as certified or not. But how are you, sort of tracking maybe some of those smaller suppliers? How are you classifying that and pulling that data in? But also, what are the types of supplier categories that you're seeing that maybe are easier to move spend into that diverse supplier category? So I think catering was one of them. Is there any other sort of major categories that you're finding it super impactful to have that diverse supplier spend recognized?
Well, for tools, we use Cvent to do all of our meeting sourcing. And in Cvent, we have an RFP question asking if you were certified. If you're not certified, it's not saying we're not going to support you, but that's one of our key supplier initiatives. And then once we get into the sourcing and we contract, when we do a meeting recap, on our Cvent recap, we ask, did we have any DEI spend for this group? And we put yes. When we're tracking our budgets and Cvent, we have all the categories. We have a standard category, food and beverage, transportation, and then we also have a DEI category. It's the same thing. You're just selecting a different budget category when we're putting that in. And then the other part of your question was, what are the easiest areas or an area that you can make the most impact to start showing and growing your program? We found that catering services, there's a lot of minority or women-owned catering companies, and in 95% of the time, your food and service are going to be 1,000 times better than what you're going to get from a chain representative. Just because a local provider is more likely to source locally, so you're not just helping their business, you're also helping other businesses. But 2, you're going to get more of a diverse menu or a more willing person to help you with that. And so that's one of the categories, but also you can look at some of your offsites and transportation. Those are also areas that you have a lot of local impact. And the biggest one right now is the hybrid area. You can source locally and source small businesses for that hybrid option or for production services.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. I think it's really interesting. It's so interesting when you start to get into all these different supplier categories, and I do think that hybrid is opening a lot more doors for us to start to track, a little bit deeper into that supply base. Anthony, I'm going to shift to you. I know that senior leadership support and buy-in was really a critical success story, or critical to the success in your particular story. Can you maybe talk about how they got involved? Was that driven by the top down? Was it sort of, bottom up, and how did that become sort of a pivotal success point to the program that you're speaking of?
Sure. So I think with this particular client, senior leadership understood the concept of mutuality. They're a family-owned global organization, and they understood they needed to help to grow their business early on, right? They work with global suppliers, and they understood and saw the impact of inequality in their supply chain. And they knew they had to take some efforts early on to, get a digital supply base in place so they wouldn't run out of product and to be able to keep up with their global demand.
That's awesome. Thank you. We've got a question that's come in. I'm just going to pause while we're here and sort of and ask it. I'll put it out to both of you. How are you vetting the claims made by suppliers about their DEI accomplishments? So what goes into that process of vetting to be able to put them on these lists? I don't know, Paula, if you have some comments on what you're doing.
Again, when we're sourcing and you're answering the question, yes, we're not asking you to provide the certification or anything like that. We're taking it that you're not going to, we believe that you're going to say the correct, or that you're going to be honest with us. And when we're tracking things, that's what we're doing. If there is a certification, again, we track it as a certification. And if it's not certified, we'll put it as non-certified D&I spend. And then we can also put them in contact with our D&I team. And we also do mentoring within the community, and they might be able to help them get into the certification program and go that route as well.
Great. There's another question in here, but Dawn, I'm just wondering if you want some elaboration on it, so that hybrid opportunities, although those local business success stories, I think we had one already from you, Paula, but anything else that comes to mind around those local businesses? I think it's going to be super important now coming out of this pandemic, right, in every area of the world, to really be helping these local and small business economically. And then if we can also, bring this diverse supplier category, and I think that's a win. And so on any other success stories within that local supply base?
This area in particular, hotels were hit very hard over the past 18 months. There were no meetings. So the AV teams and most hotels were furloughed, or in most cases, laid off. So a lot of those individuals started up their own companies. And they're suppliers and employees that we've known for years, that we've worked with at these hotels. We already have the trust in them, and we know they have the ability. So when they started approaching us, we gave a couple a chance, and we've really been surprised with how wonderful the service has been in this area. In the hybrid area, it's a new, and it's not new, but it's all of a sudden highlighted and spotlighted. And so being able to take providers that we've known for years and help support them in their new endeavor has been great. We're in the process of partnering with a new technology company. And ironically, we didn't know, but the same technology company was helping our CEO on a project she was doing. So again, supporting a minority-owned business, both personally and professionally, with TIAA.
That's awesome. Anthony, anything you want to add there?
I think Paula hit it well. One thing I would mention maybe is some of the, the output of the pandemic has created a big supply of, I would call, amenity providers, right? And we're seeing a lot of those providers who are trying to get that DE&I certification. Again, much like Paula had mentioned, we're trying to help them with that. But we are able to record and track that they have the process in place. If it is certified or if it's not, that they are looking to attain that certification. But out of the ashes of the pandemic, I think a lot of great things are starting to form.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Action piece. So I think let's stick with that a little bit. It's an area that I think is continuing to evolve, right? You've got to start simple and then grow. I think we're making some great strides already. And it's great seeing some of those questions about vetting and how do you want to categorize so that, there's maybe a couple of different tiers of supplier categories. Anthony, you're a third party. So can you talk a little bit about how you track that downstream supplier spend for some of your clients and how that's set up to sort of capture and report back?
Sure. We ask DE&I questions in our supplier and vendor RFP processes. We collect that data in our CVent tool as well. We use that, primarily as our reporting data package. And we can provide info by business unit on those key suppliers who have identified as such, right? If they are, actually a categorized supplier or not. And that falls under each specific area, just as Paula had mentioned, whether it's food and beverage, AV. It's not necessarily a financial capture for us. It's more a data capture so that we can ensure that we are identifying that detail and providing that back to our customers.
That's great. And Paula, you touched on a little bit about how you capture sort of after the fact. I'm just interested to know if anybody from both of you, is diverse supplier categorization happening at the onset? Sort of, are we identifying that in the planning process? Then is that becoming at least a conscious, thought process or idea in the front? And then how are you capturing? Because I know at the end you're capturing that data when you're reconciling a program, and where does that data go back into? Could you just talk a little bit about that?
So perfect. Part of my goals as a leader with TIAA is to increase the spend that we can control and shift market share to certain areas. And again, DEI is very big for TIAA, and this is an area that we want to grow. We don't have a set percentage like 30% or 40%. We just want to see a growth year over year. And for us, we're identifying it in CVent. We're asking upfront if it's a company that we're vetting through CVent. If we're doing restaurants for a local area, we're going to go and we're going to try to find a local provider. There's a lot of different intranets or websites that you can go to for minority-owned businesses to support them. And then the other thing is when you're looking in a certain area, especially if there's been any controversy or any concerns in that area, we'll also verify and vet that the supplier we're using isn't somebody who is not supporting certain things that we believe in. I think that's a big thing too, because you may not be aware of certain companies are not supporters of things that are passionate for your company. And that's one of the things we found out lately. But again, in the beginning, before we sign a contract, before we start going anywhere, we ask questions. And if the minority or the women-owned business is a little bit more expensive, it's not increasing your budget, it's increasing your investment. And that's the area that we'll go with.
I love that. It just showcases, right, how much of a cultural, approach DEI is for your organization. And it's great to see that is, you've kind of categorized in a way that you get hotels as sort of one category in its own, but there's a lot of other, downstream suppliers that are going to make up that meeting, that there is a different sort of path to the decision-making and the sourcing of those to sort of bring in that diverse supplier category. So that's great. And we're going to move on now. I think we've just kind of got a last slide here, but so please chat in, feel free to chat in any questions. But there is actually one question that's come in. So before we sort of give you sort of some tips and tricks or words of advice, some of the questions that either of you have within your, when you're looking for diverse suppliers, are you looking to categorize that? So what are some good vetting questions that maybe you ask upfront to make sure that there's a fit, sort of a cultural fit for you or a value fit for you based on how you're looking at the diverse suppliers? Any comments on those sort of questions that you're teeing up for these suppliers?
After we find out whether they're certified or not, we'll start asking questions. If we've elected a supplier that may not be certified, we'll ask them if they support or if they have any vendors that they would support in that area. So, because you can't always find a diverse supplier, but if you can't find that supplier, maybe they're using somebody local that you can also support.
Great. Anthony, anything else from your end?
Well, one of the key things, we try to keep it consistent in all of our vendor questions, right? And if we get the response back that yes, they are, we'll take a secondary step to have a verbal conversation with them, right? To flesh that out a little bit further, specific to the scope of work for the client that we're working on. If it is, something of a high dollar spend, obviously we might have access to use many providers, right? To cover that, some of those key categories. And if it's a smaller meeting or mid-sized meeting, we may only need to stick with one. So just depending on that scope, that really helps us define how deep we'll go in terms of the questioning comparison of supplier to supplier.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So Paula, I'm going to ask just one sort of last words of advice for our audience. What piece of advice maybe would you give to somebody that's just starting out on this journey, knowing that you're sort of in it and have been in it for quite some time? What do you maybe wish you knew back then? Or how would you, it's somewhat of a daunting subject to get started. So what would the advice be that you would give somebody that is just sort of starting out on setting up a program?
Think big, but start manageable, something that you can manage. We all want to conquer the world and we all want to have world peace, but maybe if we could just target one area, then we can show people how great it is and the impact that you've been able to make. Start with your categories that you can move share. Transportation, food and beverage, offsite suppliers, AV, those are areas, especially right now, that you can help shift your market share to and see the difference in the impact in the area. And then you can take that to your senior leadership and get their support to get more support, more suppliers, more resources, so that you can grow that program over time.
That's great. Thank you. And Anthony, anything from you? Any last words of wisdom here?
Yeah, I would say celebrate success, right? To Paula's point, there's been a lot of talk today around metrics, and I think it's important to have the ability to report, right? And that showcases that we are kind of managing that process. But ultimately, if we are looking for equity, we have to change some minds, right? So if we can take those smaller components and share that and, kind of bellow up that positive outcome of what we were delivered, whether it was a great, new product or solution that, a DE&I supplier brought to our attention, or if it's something specific in terms of the cost savings we're able to obtain, we need to share that internally within their organization, right? We're a third party, so we're helping them up level that information. I think for us, that's one of the important things, that we're helping them take those small successes and push them up.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, thank you all. Dawn, I'm going to hand back to you, but just say thank you to everybody. We could probably, talk about this all day and really get into the granular details, but we're excited to have shared just a little snippet here today and looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks, Dawn. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Shauna, Paula, and Anthony. And you're right, we can continue this for a very long time. Our next session is DEI and difficult conversations. We have Adrienne Cole Johnson, who is joining us. She is the engagement expert and consultant at Envoy. And we also have Ace Callwood, Director at Envoy. Thank you and welcome to both of you today.
Thanks so much, Dawn. Really excited to be here. Adrian, how are you?
Hello. Good morning. Hey, Ace, and hello, everyone else who's out there.
There we go. So yeah, we've got a great crowd listening in, a crowd that I just sent a note to. I said, we're ready. Clearly, Adrian and I are behind the scenes, just chomping at the bit, ready to get into this conversation. And we've had an incredible day already. I'm looking back through just a raft of notes that I've picked up. Adrian and I will unpack some of the things we heard today. And of course, tee us up to be in Orlando in November. Couldn't be more excited for that. So a shout out to Grant, Lisa, David, a shout out to Sean, Annalise, and Kira. And of course, the session we just wrapped up, Shauna, Anthony, and Paula. Thanks to all of you for giving us some good nuggets to play with over the course of the next, half an hour, maybe 35 minutes. Adrian, you ready to rock?
I am. I'm ready. Are you?
I love it. I'm always ready. You know that. First and foremost, it is just incredible how small this world is sometimes. Adrian and I were chatting behind the scenes. Sean Cole from Delta, a familiar last name because apparently Sean is the brother of Adrian's sister, brother-in-law of Adrian's sister. The smallest
world. It's a small world. Sean, if you're still out there, hello. He's doing amazing work with Delta. So since we're all family here, yes, Sean is my brother-in-law's brother. So I was so excited to learn from him and all he's doing in his work. So yeah, it's a small, great world.
We are literally all family. In this case, if there is ever a case for the barbecue trademark, this would be it. That said, we've got a ton to jump into, and I want to start with a couple of the things that I pulled out of the last couple sessions. You know, we have this ongoing conversation about metrics, and that's great. And then, of course, bottom line, and diversity gets us to a good place bottom line wise. There's like, I don't know, Adrian, I feel some tension with that as an idea. As we talk about DEI, on one hand, we're absolutely right. All of the data suggests that the bottom line is improved as we bring more diversity into our organizations. On the other hand, and I know because we do this a lot, you have heard me rail against that as kind of a talking point, because I think we're past that. And as I kind of want to tee that up as an idea to discuss. For those watching, Adrian and I don't agree on everything. We fight often. It's one of the most fun things I get to do in my day-to-day is spar with Adrian. So Adrian, I'll tee that up as kind of the first prompt. Are we excited about bottom line being improved, or is there some higher calling when we talk and think about DEI?
I think the great thing is that's something we do agree on, Ace. So we actually, we do agree on that, right? I think in a lot of companies, there's been a need to kind of justify the focus of a lot of the DEI work that's happening. But I just think with the current state of affairs, it is a higher calling, right? It's more about, it's just as much about, I should say, about connecting with individuals, getting to know your colleagues and your peers, and creating a workplace that's conducive to having those conversations, even what we're talking about here about what we often say difficult conversations. So I think it's a bit deeper than that. But then I also understand you often have to pull together, whether it's your direction, your talking points, different things are going to feel good to certain people. But I think in the greater context of, just kind of moving us along, just humanity, right? And understanding each other, I think is a bit greater and really sets the conversation up in a way that the work can get, move further along.
I jotted down a note. It was diversity is not about charity. Diversity is not about bottom line. That is a natural byproduct and a valuable one, perhaps a beneficial one. But for me, you talked about humanity, that word, and I like that. I think we'll unpack that a little bit. I think the word for me is legacy. Right? Like if we're thinking about what we're doing in our organizations today, can we move 50 or 100 years into the future and kind of think about where our company is and how we'll look at our company years down the road, how further generations, our kids or our kids' kids. There's a legacy component here of, did I do the right thing in the right way for the right people. And when we talk about the right people, that is, we've talked about equity and inclusion, that's everyone. So I think a lot, and I challenge folks to consider legacy alongside bottom line and CSR and, you know, ERGs. I mean, like there's a piece of, am I doing the right thing, and will I be proud about that down the road? I think that's an important thing to move the needle.
Absolutely. That's it. I often think about going beyond the margin, right? And so you think about some of us who may really live, work, and play in the margin. You know, how are my efforts going to help those in the margin go beyond the margin, right? How am I ensuring that, you know, I'm creating a space where folks will feel better where they work, you know, that folks, when they're interacting with, you know, the company or the corporation, that it just feels a little different. And so I love that you pulled the word legacy, Ace. I think that really encompasses the whole of what we're talking about. So great point.
Yeah, I want to reference Kira from Delta. She said, we've got to mitigate unconscious bias at all levels, and we have to focus on being consciously inclusive. And so when you're talking about the folks in the margins, bringing them to beyond the margins, perhaps, that's a really big piece. And I think it's an important note to make. That's the work, the long work, as we like to say in the DEI world.
Yep, it is. And it's about being proximate, right? A lot of times we're not bringing the folks proximate to the change that will happen into the room, centering them in the conversation. And so as we're talking through DEI, making sure that we're really ensuring those who are most proximate to that change are there, and that their voice is not just heard, it's amplified through the work that's happening as well.
Yeah, and I think you're pulling from one of the comments Annalise made as well, right? Find the stakeholder group you can work with and just get going, right? And so getting the right folks, the right voices in the room for the group you're trying to better an experience for. That's a lot of the conversation we had on measuring the metrics, of course, and surveying. Can we ask folks what they need? You know, there was one of the comments I probably won't do it justice, but there was something akin to, we don't care what you said. The goal is actually just getting better as an organization. So if we get the right folks in the room and we've created a culture where they can share and be candid and be open about what's working well and what's not, that is how we move our organizations forward. And that's a huge thing. We've got to create the space to do that, which is where I want to head in our conversation, if that's all right. Cool. So a tiny bit of background for the folks watching. Adrian and I wear multiple hats across the board, but my full-time, my day-to-day is at a firm called Envoy in Richmond, Virginia. Really interesting having DEI type conversations from the former capital of the Confederacy to start. That's a real
interesting.
Isn't it? But this conversation, as we talk about DEI, is so much more than that. I think we've got this Western lens, rightfully so. That is where I live. That's the work that I do in my communities. Adrian, very similarly. But for GBTA, we're talking about a global conversation. Rightfully so. How do we as Westerners perhaps travel elsewhere? And how do we as a global society make sure we're creating environments where anybody can feel comfortable, even with language barriers, even with cultural barriers, even as we navigate the world and our work and the people we interact with? And so Envoy as a firm, our focus is negotiation and mediation. I'm a negotiator, I'm a mediator, I'm a facilitator, but really our job is to bring stakeholders together and move issues and conversations forward. And so I want to talk, Adrian, about some of the tactical, the practical ways to influence how humans make decisions for better, if you will. And, you know, your background as a social worker, your background as kind of a counselor and someone facilitating how families in education are feeling supported. I mean, you've got just so many pieces. Do you want to give a tiny bit of your background before we get into some of the tactical?
I will. So, you know, if anyone in the room is a parent, a grandparent, just has a young person that they love that's been in school over the last 18 or 19 months. I've had the privilege of working with a huge school system, 6th largest school system in Virginia, as the chief engagement officer. And so it's been interesting. It's been really interesting to navigate. You talk about difficult conversations, but just a difficult time, right? And so I'm often leading with how do we engage amongst diverse populations to make sure that we're communicating what needs to be communicated, good, bad, or indifferent, but doing it in a warm way and in a compassionate way as well. So it keeps me busy for sure, but it's nothing I enjoy more than ensuring that we understand each other, right? And that we're working with each other and working alongside each other to get things done. So yeah.
Great. So what I want to do is I'll kind of pull from my world of negotiation and mediation, and you'll pull from your world of family engagement and social work, and we'll kind of drop that on top of the conversation around global business travel and making for a more inclusive community of travelers throughout the world. So that's, I think, what we'll do with our next 25 minutes, if that works for you.
I love it.
I do too. Cool. So first and foremost, you kind of alluded as we were opening, difficult conversations versus something else. We often talk about DEI as being a tough thing. Not everybody's on board all the time. Not everybody's coming from the same place. We often don't even have the same language across our communities or within our organizations with respect to DEI. And that tees up some tension as we work into, hey, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is why it's good. Difficult conversations are often how we phrase, how we get buy-in and have to work through some of the bureaucracy or differing opinions in our organizations. But you don't love the term difficult conversations. Tell me why and give me an alternative.
I don't. I think difficult makes it difficult, right? I think we complicate it more when we say, I have to have a hard conversation. And, we're going through this difficult thing. I really like to reframe difficult and say necessary, right?
Okay.
If we look at what's in front of us as just a necessary journey, a necessary hallway that we're walking through to get us to our next place, it feels a bit more inviting. I think the other thing that happens with difficult, because yes, it can be hard, but I think because of it, sometimes we shy away from what really needs to be said. And so you bring it in the room, but you really don't touch it, right? And so I often, when we're talking about, and you said something earlier, and I see it in the chat about just creating comfort, finding comfort in understanding that it may be difficult, but it may also be rewarding, right? It may be difficult, but it's definitely necessary. It may be difficult, but it may be transformative to how your organization is working. And so even if we embrace the hard, making sure that you pair it up with something that, provides a bit of optimism, and provides a bit of just kind of necessity when you're walking through conversations. So that's one of my things, Ace.
I do. It's almost like we've been on a DEI conversation or two before. No, I think that is huge, right? Difficult, and I think you threw out rewarding, transformational, necessary. From the world of negotiation, we think often about priming and framing. And if we've primed a conversation as this is going to be difficult, it's going to be hard, this might not be fun. And if we frame it as, this is going to be difficult and I'm going to find some strife with the person across the table, or oftentimes in organizations just next to us at the same table, we have already put ourselves in a tough spot. But hey, this is a transformational conversation that if we navigate well together, we can get to a good place and start affecting change in our organization. I think that framing is really important.
And Ace, and I'll throw it out to you. Think about times when you've had to get through something hard or difficult, right? Did you run to it? Did you prolong it? Just what's that interaction when you frame it as such? I think about even in my world, when I probably embrace the verbiage a little bit more, it just takes longer, and when you look at some of the DEI work that's necessary, that really needs to be moved forward, sometimes we're in a longer phase and a longer pattern just because it feels so difficult. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I want to note to the audience, if and as you have questions, feel free to drop those in real time. Yes. I've got an eye on chat and the Q&A. Would love to hear from all of you on what you're doing, how you're thinking about things, and maybe if we can shed some light on what you've heard over the course of really this entire collaboratory. While we're doing that, Adrienne, you mentioned the word compassion, and I think that tees us up for one of your favorite things, the 3 C's. So again, I want to get into kind of the tactics of how we shift decision-making and behavior for a more inclusive culture within our organizations. Talk to me about that 3 C's framework you love so much.
Yeah, and so the 3 C's are really, it's really under an umbrella of impactful compassion, right? And so how can we lead, as many of you all are doing, how can you lead in your organizations, you know, even at home? I do it at home with my 8-year-old daughter, Naomi, all the time, but how can I lead things along? Hopefully I'll have some chance to infuse some of our stories here this morning. But how can you lead things along in a compassionate way, but also creating the impact that you want? And so kind of quick tidbits on the 3 C's. You've got connection, you've got communication, and you've got collaboration. And so even in the framework of the conversation we're having about difficult conversations, you got to connect, right? If you're not connected to the person you're speaking with, who's receiving the information, they aren't going to feel it. It's necessary that you create time to really get to know. Connecting doesn't mean I have to find something exactly, the same as what you do. It doesn't mean we have to be on the same accord, but it does mean I need to get to know you a bit more. I need to kind of stand in a place of openness and understanding. So that's connection. Second one, and I'm just going to go quickly and we can have more dialogue. Second one is communication, right? And so not sure who in the room has heard of the saying, it's how you say it, right? But we often talk about
Adrian, if you're talking about me, I don't know if that was a subtweet in this session. I get in trouble with my partner often, not for what I said, but how I said it. Is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. All right. Sure. Yeah, that happens with me a lot. It's how you say. I'm that person, especially when it's sensitive, right? And so, but I've taken it a step further. My mom really drilled that in, and how you say it and how you express yourself. But it's how you say it. It's also when you say it and where you say it to. So how can you kind of bring in all of the senses when you're having these necessary conversations? Maybe when you're moving a team along, what's the environment that you're setting up to make sure that it's conducive for the information that's being, shared and, given and received. And so really thinking about that.
You've got a good piece here, Adrian. You and I talk about this often, the idea or the questions that we ought to ask ourselves as we're going into a conversation to perhaps affect change. First off, does it need to be said? Second, does it need to be said now? Third, does it need to be said by me? And so asking those questions really allow us to step into a conversation, perhaps giving some tough feedback, perhaps hearing the survey results and sharing that with leadership team. There is a time and a place, and we're really talking, as we talk about compassion, creating space in our organizations to have those necessary, but sometimes, difficult conversations. I think asking that and understanding when and how and where, and of course, what we say is really important.
Yeah, and you hit on one of my most reflective. I tell you, I have those 3 questions of, does it have to be said? Does it have to be said now? Does it have to be said by me? Going through those 3 questions has sometimes caused me to not have to speak, but maybe identify the person that should be in the room. It's caused me to look at the timing. I wish I could do this at home with Josh, though. I don't do a good job on my personal, but professional, I'm great. But, does it have to be said now is a big one, right? And so just really thinking about that through that lens, it kind of ties back to what we were sharing earlier about having those most proximate to change in the room. And I'll tell you, I do it often with schools, highlighting student voice and parent voice when there's an opportunity. I can talk about it and I love it, but the peer-to-peer learning that happens when you have someone in the room that's lived it transforms the experience, right? And so thank you for sharing that bit. I hope people kind of take that nugget and apply it, and then we can hear about it in the conference in November.
And so there's a 3rd C, right? We've only covered 2. It was connection. So making sure we're getting some time.
This is a test.
Communication. Did I get the second one right? Communication.
Got the second one right. You should
All
know the
right.
third one by now, but I'm curious if you.
Collaboration.
Yes. Somebody put the clapping emojis in the chat. Yes. Collaboration, working together. You know, who's been in a situation where someone drops a heavy topic on them and then they just walk away, right? So you have to be prepared when you show up, when you're connecting with individuals, when you're communicating this hard or necessary stuff, you've got to move it in a way of collaboration with those that you're working with. And again, that may be with your team that you're leading and maybe with your peers. And so when we talk through, you know, what collaboration means, I often think about, in most cases, you're cheering or coaching, right? You know, if someone is along their journey, it may just be that you're cheering on the sideline. They've got it. They're already motivated. If you're coaching, you may be modeling a bit more. Maybe it's behavior, you know, that you're trying to that you want them to show up with. And so I really, again, two more sub-Cs, subset Cs under collaboration, thinking about a cheering model or even a coaching model to move things along. There's something about collaboration
Adrian,
and how.
as leaders, what it sounds like you're saying is we have a lot of roles that we can step into as we are trying to affect culture and change and move issues, particularly on the DEI front, but really applicable to anything we're doing in our organization. We can be cheerleaders, right? Like we can be on the sidelines saying, hey, this team is doing incredible, and I just want to highlight the people doing this work. Or sometimes we are coaches, right? And sometimes we are showing by example. We're getting on the field, we're modeling behavior, and then we're stepping off back into our cheerleader role. But understanding what role we should be in, what hat we should have on at any given point is really one of the ways we're intentional about affecting change in our orgs.
You got it. You got it. When you said I pictured you with pom-poms, like cheering on the side, but you do.
Big pom-pom guy, big pom-pom guy.
Right. But no, you absolutely do. It's important when I think about some of the like deeply engaged initiatives that we're all moving along, even when I think about some of the folks who are on the call, it takes stamina, right? It takes a bit of, you know, when something is moving along and when something is working well, you may not be as involved, but you still want that group to move it along, right? And so keeping folks motivated, but kind of doing an internal check of knowing who needs you where and who needs you when, I think makes a big difference for creating some sustainability around some of the efforts that I think many companies are getting to now.
Yeah, so sustainability takes us kind of down one thread, and I want to run that direction. But there was also a piece that you said, and I want to make sure we capture that, that idea of collaboration, particularly when it comes to hard topics. We get survey results that say, hey, we're not missing the mark. Or we look at our metrics because we're data driven and we say, hey, we're not doing what we thought we would at the pace that we thought we would. Or when there was a microaggression or something that said that was uncomfortable and maybe could have been said better, right? Like that idea of collaboration is really important if we think about the people that we're trying to shift culture alongside and consider them as partners. We don't blindside partners. We don't surprise partners, but that's often how we broach some of these sometimes difficult but necessary topics. We just drop these bombs on people and say, hey, this is wrong. This is what we missed the mark on. You figure it out, you do better. If we're truly collaborating and stepping in as partners, we say, hey, I want to make some space to maybe bring up a thing that'll be uncomfortable, but in pursuit of moving our organization forward and doing right by our people. Like we've got options in how we approach these things. And what I'm hearing is collaborative nature in approaching some of these conversations and treating folks as partners. We don't blindside. We don't, cut them down at the knees. We say, hey, I'm giving this gift and I'm sharing it with you and I'll help you move it forward. But I want to give you something that might be uncomfortable and we have to create the space for that. Did I kind of synthesize that decently?
No, you've got it. It really is, it looks like working alongside and not working for or doing to, and it really is working with, right? And so, it's even as leaders in your field showing up, knowing that I don't know it all, right? I don't have all of the answers. And so I often talk about just transparency and empathy and what that looks like even in leadership and how effective that is even, as you're working across teams to increase your understanding, of one another, but also to show up and to just have a bit of kind of genuineness, when you're broaching these topics, I say it often too. I mean, even as a Black woman in this world, there's a lot that I'm learning, and I think someone shared it earlier, DEI is not just race, there's so much that we're learning, right? And so embracing it in that way and having a bit of openness. But what I also say to people is most change really happens and happens in safe spaces. And so that connection bit, when I talk about the 3 C's, they all kind of work simultaneously, but that connection is really a necessary foundation to move to collaboration or even to move to communication. Because if you're not connected to your people, they're not going to get it. It's not going to feel real, it's not going to feel authentic in a way. And so making sure that there's some real intentionality about connecting even before getting to that place of significant change.
Yeah, and there's an interesting balance there in connection, right? Because on one hand, we think about it at the individual level. Like, can I connect human to human with a person? And that's really important. On the flip side, though, right, as we think about diversity, diversity isn't about one person. Like, an individual can't be diverse because diversity is relative. We are in that we're both Black folks on a talk right now. This is not necessarily a diverse panel with respect to race. It's a diverse panel with respect to gender. It's a diverse panel with respect to background and professional kind of accomplishments, but diversity can't apply to an individual. So we've got to think about the connection holistically across our organization. How many facets of diversity? And you're right, that is sexual orientation, that is race, that's ethnicity, that's gender, that is ability, both physical and intellectual. I mean, there are so many facets of diversity. I think it was Sean who mentioned, are you a person living in a country where you weren't born? There are so many pieces there as global business travelers that we have to think about and cater to and be intentional around. And so we've got this kind of high level connection organizationally. Are we saying things that resonate? Is that signal to noise ratio, as I like to talk about, is that as close to 1-to-1 as we can be? As I say things, is it resonating with my audience? On the other hand, we're thinking about the human to human, me talking to Adrienne Cole Johnson connection, and both of those, as we think about motive and what drives people and what they hear and what they resonate with or connect to, we've got to kind of consider and encompass all of those pieces as we communicate some things that are really important for the sustainability of our organization.
Absolutely. Yep.
I love it. All right, so I want to get into some of the tactical, and I know you are at the helm of some large scale cultural shifts, as are most of the folks tuned in today. As you think about getting a project going, you mentioned that word sustainability, building momentum for change. I want to kind of note one of the last things we just heard from Paula said, think big, but think about what you can manage. So how do you tackle large-scale cultural change in the organizations that you have the privilege, pleasure, and sometimes fun of working with?
Yeah, I took note of what Paula shared too, because sometimes there's so much that you want to do, right? And we are so well intended to move things forward. However, priority, and it's hard to say the word prioritization when everything is so significant and important. And so I often say, this is one of those, even when I get out of my touchy-feely self, right? But you connect it to really the strategic plan and goal of your organization. Of course, you can look at data to inform, whether it's your internal workforce and your customers too. But how are you kind of laying those kind of points of connection with people who are your stakeholders, right? But then, of course, hopefully that would be paired with even your strategic plan and your priority goals. And so really letting that guide you, it can get really tricky because you may have someone who's really loud in the room, but you may have another group that is, you know, highly well represented in the group. And so I always say, try to pair up your priorities with your strategic plan and things of the sort. I think once you do that, I go back to the word proximate. You find those folks who are proximate to the work, that are passionate about the work, that really want to be involved. And you build your, I want to say champions, but it's football season. What's the word when you start in football, Ace? You probably watch football. Kickoff, but the team, like the starters, right? Was that basketball?
Oh, yeah. The starting squad. There we go.
Yeah, your starting squad. You built your starting squad, your champions who are really going to be your ambassadors for the work. And you start there, you know? And so what do they say? Slow and steady wins the race.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, slow and steady wins the race. These were created in a systemic way. And so it will take systemic work to undo some of the things that we're working on. And so I always tell people to pace yourself. Just pace yourself. And I think keeping that framework in mind, along with the fact that it's really long game work, you know, you may start work, and for many who are on the call, you may have started this work years and years and years ago, you know, but preparing to maybe even pass that on to the next person that'll come after you and the next person after that. And so just really thinking about what can I control in my sphere of influence at this moment that will really set us up for some long-term success. But so I kind of think through those lenses. And I think because I know it took us a long time to get here, it may take us just as long to get to a different place. But it helps to ease the excitement of moving change along, but knowing that it may not be as fast as we would like it to be.
Yeah, I pulled that kind of sound bite. I'm glad this is recorded because I'll crop that and put it on LinkedIn at some point, I'm sure. You know, these systems were created in a systemic way, so it'll take systemic work to undo some of the damage. It's the ACE paraphrase version, but I think pretty close to how you shared it. I think that's so important. You mentioned the long work is a phrase that we use in the DEI world. Like, it is long work. There are a series of sprints, I suppose, but really we're running a marathon to undo generations of some cultural, societal pieces that have put us in a place where we have to have these conversations. They are necessary, but perhaps transformational if we orient to them well. I like that slow and steady. I use a phrase, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Kind of borrowed that from my days working for the Army. We said that you've got to get the mechanics down. You've got to understand why you're doing a thing so you can go do it at pace. But like, we've got to get the mechanics, the muscle memory of shifting culture, of having necessary transformational conversations, of sharing, collecting data from the right stakeholders, putting the right folks at the table, and then sharing what we learned, what we're doing to change, and where we fell short. Like, that is uncomfortable, but getting the muscle memory down allows us to do that as a part of our DNA as our organizations get to where we want them to be.
Absolutely. And I do want to add in quickly, starting small is a great thing, right? Because there's so much attention on what's happening in DEI. What you don't want to do is to start something and not have the commitment and consistency that's needed to move it along, right? So I think that's a bit of feedback as I hear peers, oh, we started this thing, but I don't know what happened, and then this other thing came along. And so committing to things that are that you know the organization can commit to, right? My daughter, we went to Disney pre-COVID, right? She knew the morning we left. The morning of, because if I had told her that we were going and it didn't happen, oh my goodness, the accountability that I have to have with that, right? And so really thinking through that, making sure it's something that the organization and that leadership can really commit to, making sure that it's something that can remain consistent, and doing that thing with quality. And so then building upon that is preferred than doing a lot and not giving it the proper attention.
I love it. And that brings us just about to time. So I've got a quick plug Adrian and I will be in Orlando on the
Yes.
main stage on Wednesday, the 17th. We'll be hosting a breakfast show. She will be next to me on main stage, and we'll have a couple guests from a couple industries hanging out with us, talking about what they're doing in their respective fields. And then we've got a breakout workshop with Carol and crew on Friday, the 19th, where Adrian and I will get into some of the nitty, the gritty, the tactical in-person live from Orlando. So join us for that in Orlando. Couldn't be more excited to join everyone. And all of this is in pursuit of what Grant has just shared in our chat, that the DEI committee and all of the work that GBTA is doing, the reason we're here today, and we'll be having similar conversations down in Orlando, is really about creating a better world for all of the travelers bouncing from here to there, to and fro. And so Adrian and I, of course, are thrilled to be a part of the conversation. And with that, a thank you to everybody who tuned in. We're going to hand it back over to Maria to wrap us up as we approach the top of the hour. Appreciate everybody tuning in.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Ace and Adrian. What an amazing session. And to all the presenters today, and in particular to Grant and all the GBTA DEI committee. They put so much love and effort into this, and hours of time. You know, I know they're going to be making a huge difference. I also want to make sure that we don't forget to thank the GBTA team. And you guys, it may look easy and it comes off flawless, but there's a lot of effort behind the scenes to make these things happen and happen so successfully. So a big shout out and thank you to Amanda, to Jill, and to Dawn. But, you know, in the beginning, I told you guys, let's look at some gems. And I have so many great notes here. I'm sure you guys do as well. But just to highlight a few, first of all, the passion that came throughout this entire session, you guys, it's contagious. It is amazing. And I'm telling you, just the passion alone, I know we're all going to be successful on this. And I have sat through hundreds and hundreds of, webinars in my day, but never seen this level of passion and commitment. So a couple little notes. I loved some of the things that said about unconscious bias is for all of us to consider. I also like the point about that metrics matter, because you know the old rule, if you're not measuring it, it doesn't get done and it doesn't matter. So metrics are very, very important. Of course, I love the fact it talks about data, which is one of my favorite subjects. The other is around intentional strategy. It has to be part from the top down and to be a strategy that then filters out through all aspects of the business, that it's got to be more than optics. I also love the talk around don't get stuck in the middle. I think that was just incredible, thought-provoking. In addition, equity and equality are not always equal. Okay, thought that was great. And I did love the conversation that sometimes the difficult and very uncomfortable are necessary and important. And I love the 3 C's: connection, collaboration, and communication. Although I'm going to add to what Adrian said, I think it's also who it's coming from, because I always laugh that you can say the same thing to your partner or spouse that somebody else says, and it comes across better from them. And then I loved starting small is okay. Don't overlook that, because it's still starting. But I think it all comes down to this. We all need to be part of this. It needs to be a continuous connecting thread across every single thing we do in order to effectively advance the DVI initiatives and foster the necessary change that we need to see. It's critical. And this topic, as you know, is a very, very important topic to our industry. And it will be mainstream thing that you're going to see on the stage and throughout the GBTA convention in November. This year's convention reflects the time we're in, as it always does, and it's designed for change that we're all experiencing in all aspects of it. So I want to close by saying I hope that you'll join us in Orlando. Be well, take care, and look forward to seeing you there.